It's 10:29. This is Dan Petro. He's going to talk about DNP3. If you don't know what that is, it's a very important protocol in the ICS world. I've seen Dan talk a couple times at Black Hat DEF CON. I think he's a great speaker. He was my personal invite. Without further ado, this is Dan Petro and DNP3 Security.
All right, thanks so much. So first off, I wanted to sort of poll the audience to see if I was right about the title of this. How many people in the audience actually are familiar with DNP3 out of curiosity? We have a couple of hands. Okay, cool. So I'm sorry if some of this might be a little remedial for the both of you, but the rest of you are in for a treat. Sorry if this is a bit heavy for so early on a Saturday. So hey, I'm Dan Petro. I was a longtime pen tester with Bishop Fox. Right now I do work with our capability development team. So it's like building out tooling for the team for like attack surface mapping, exploit development, that sort of thing. So I'm definitely coming at this from a pen tester's perspective and not from like a civil engineering perspective. So if there's any civil engineers in the audience, I'm really sorry. So this is a talk about DNP3. DNP is the distributed network protocol. So right off the bat, I kind of hate it. This doesn't really tell you anything about like what the actual protocol is. It's a network protocol. You just wasted two of the words of your acronym. It's not even distributed, like in a modern sense. It's not like decentralized. It's completely centralized. So it's just words. It doesn't matter. And also, this is version 3 because apparently we went to the George Lucas School for numbering things. Whatever. It doesn't matter. This is about the power grid. This is a talk about hacking the power grid. So back in the day, if you wanted to turn off a thing in the power grid, if you wanted to remotely actuate, or if you wanted to actuate something in the power grid to reroute power, to change voltages, you used to have to drive down to the equipment and like turn it off. Like if a tree fell on a power line and it's live and you don't want that to be dangling in the street, right? You used to have operators drive over and like pull a switch to turn that off. That is not how things work anymore. It's all computerized. These are all managed remotely. And DNP3 is one of the key players in this entire process. So this is like fundamentally what this talk is about. So before we get going on exactly DNP3 and like some of its flaws, we're going to have to talk a bit about background. Now, normally I hate it when talks start with a lengthy background section that discuss the context of everything that came before it. But trust me, this is important for you to understand the consequences of everything that happens. So there's not one network exactly that we're talking about here, but in fact two. There's the electrical network, the thing that pushes electrons down wires and powers the lights in this room, and then there's the computer network that is overlaid on top of it that controls all the switches and relays that control the electrical grid. Makes sense. Oh, also, before I get too far, I guess this is a small enough audience where if anybody has any like questions, comments, insults, or abuse, feel free to just sort of shout it out. We could probably do questions in the middle as well. I could do questions at the end if you're feeling shy, but if there's any burning desires, go ahead and just shout it out. So let's talk about the electrical network. I'm assuming that you're coming at this from a perspective where perhaps you understand that there's, generation somewhere, there's consumption on the other end, and in the middle there's just kind of this question marks, like, I don't know, there's wires or whatever. So let's zoom in a little bit on this middle piece, right? Flesh that out a little bit further. So this is the part where I have to warn the civil engineers in the audience that I'm going to be making a lot of statements that are like 95% true. The power grid in the United States is one large machine in a very literal sense, it's all just plugged into each other. It all shares a similar design. It all works the same way, but all the details change. Things fundamentally work at the state and local level. That's how they're implemented. So while the broad swaths are going to be true here, the exact implementation details are going to be up to your utility about how they chose to do it, what the exact materials they chose, what exact devices to use, what implementations to use. So whatever. It's just warning. If you are afraid to say anything that's not exactly 100% true, you're just never going to say anything. So anyway, after the generation, electricity is sent over to a transmission station over a really, really big cable. You've seen these things. These are like high voltage towers, just because of the way that physics works. If you want to send electricity over long distances, you have to send it over high voltage because you get less loss that way. Also, fun fact, if you look carefully at these things the next time, you'll notice that they almost always come in triplets, in like pairs of 3, because they use tri-phase power. How cool. Also, at the very top of that, you'll see a ground cable, because these things get struck by lightning a lot. So this is sent over these like gigantic transmission lines, though sometimes the transmission station actually is co-located in a generation station, but whatever. To one of these guys. This is a transmission station. I tried to get a picture of a transmission station. They're kind of hard to get a photograph of, funny, especially a Creative Commons licensed one. This might not be a transmission station, but it sort of looks like one. So I chose it. This is actually from Germany, I think. So I don't know. But in any case, yeah, the main point of the transmission station is to step down the electricity from something that, like, a big nuclear generator station or something like that might produce, down to something that can actually be transported around town. These things are typically secure facilities. They'll be like guys with guns and no sense of humor guarding them, because they typically represent like a single point of failure for a system, since like an entire generating station has to go through them. Then, from the transmission station, they'll send electricity off to a network of distribution stations. These are much smaller electrical substations that you're probably more familiar with. They look like these. You might actually live right next door to one of these things. They're around in your neighborhood. They're spread all around town. I haven't found one in Savannah yet. I was looking on the drive over. But I'm sure if you just drive in any direction, you're going to see something that looks remarkably similar to this. So on one end, you just have high voltage. On the other end, you'll have household voltage that's stepped down. One of the primary duties of an electrical substation is just to take the high voltage and step it down to something that you can actually use. But of course, there's a lot more going on inside of these things. They regulate the voltage. They reroute things, because of course, it's not just like a linear path where like A goes in, B comes out. There's like an entire grid of like, do you want to send electricity here or not send it there? There's lots of like real-time decisions that have to be made. These things are modern marvels, and we don't pay enough attention to them. Also, I'm not using exact numbers here because, like, it depends. The power grid is complicated and annoying. So, notably, this system is set up in a way that if a tree in a large storm gets knocked over and hits an electrical line, then there's not any like single point of failure amongst the distribution stations, to the extent possible, right? In this instance, electricity can route around and not incur any like loss of connectivity for any particular neighborhood, which is good. This is all part of reliability. It's built into the system on purpose. Of course, some assholes like to try to just directly attack the electrical substations themselves. This has happened in a few instances where people just take assault rifles and just shoot at electrical substations. The FBI is very interested in if you have any more information about that. But in any case, even in this sort of instance where an electrical substation bursts into flames because somebody shot it with an assault rifle, it sucks to be this house, but it doesn't impact the rest of the system as a whole, right? The grid itself doesn't go down just because one distribution station goes down. It's like, again, just built into the reliability of the system as a whole. This is all good. All right, so let's talk about the computer network. The computer network that's like overlays on top of this electrical network. So at the very top, there's an energy management system, or just EMS. The energy management system is a piece of software, as in it's like, with an implementation that sends computer network signals. But it's also a group of people, a group of human beings that are like sitting in a station somewhere that make decisions about how electricity should be routed and are like remotely operating all these substations. But of course, you can't talk to a substation. A substation is like a facility. You have to talk to a particular device, which is a remote terminal unit or an RTU. Everything's an acronym, I'm sorry. These RTUs can look a little bit like this. This is just one that I happen to find that is, has, again, a Creative Commons license in the photo. This one happens to be modular, so that's neat. The main purpose of the RTU is to serve as an intermediary between those shot callers, the energy management system folks, and the actual devices that actuate the electrical network. So switches, relays, and just miscellaneous electrical stuff that need to physically move a wire over here so that it disconnects this network and reconnects that one, or changes this voltage to that one, or if a telephone pole is dangling in a road, that we can disconnect it, right? That can happen in a split second rather than hours as somebody drives over to it. So that's the purpose of these things. Mostly the individual devices will talk over serial. If you look closely at this, which you probably can't, you'll see just a ton of serial ports on this, and that's just mostly how the individual actuators work. They just hook up via serial. But this is all local. This is inside of the electrical substation, right? And again, it doesn't matter that the connection is serial per se, because the whole system is designed where if any individual substation were to be destroyed, if it were just to burn to the ground, or if somebody were to walk in and start pulling wires, then the entire system doesn't go down because of that. All you would do is reduce electricity for the immediate downstream consumers of that substation. And probably in a way that could be recovered too. Cool. So the energy management system basically talks out to these individual actuators through the RTUs, and that connection happens over DNP3. It only took us 45 slides, but we got there. My slides go quick. This typically happens over TCP/IP, but again, it depends. DNP3 actually specifies its own transport layer that you can use. I don't think a lot of people do. Again, it's very complicated. So let's engage in a little bit of what's the worst that could happen. This is an important part of the conversation. I think a lot of conversations, a lot of presentations or papers you'll see around DNP3 just kind of stop short of discussing this about oh, you could remotely operate machinery, and then people just hand wave from there. But really, how bad does this get? Okay, so at level 1, we could turn the lights off, right? If you could remotely operate a substation, you could just turn the power off. So you've got a distribution station here, and you just take the link, and you sever it, and then the lights go off for a particular area. And that's not great. Again, I come from Phoenix, and so Phoenix in the summertime, it's 120 degrees Fahrenheit pretty often. It becomes very unpleasant in the summertime. Not just unpleasant, literally hundreds of people die from the heat in the summer, on the regular, in the normal times. If you could imagine a hospital or something just going down, they've got diesel generators maybe, but you don't want to test those things. So this is bad, but it could be worse, especially since if you turn the lights off, you always have the ability to turn them back on again. Especially since in this scenario, you haven't done any actual damage, you just sort of turn the lights off and the substations are still perfectly operable. And so people will notice pretty quickly that this has happened and just sort of flip the switch the other direction. So this is where I'd like to introduce you to something that I like to call Petro's Law. This is a thing I'm trying to make happen. Help me out here. It can always be worse. No matter how bad you think it can always be worse. So let's engage in a little bit of this. So how much worse exactly? If you can turn out the lights for one place, you might be able to turn the lights out for more places. So imagine for a moment here that there's some vulnerability in the energy management system or in the protocol or something, right, that allows an attacker to impersonate the energy management system. So you can send messages in this system to remotely operate the machinery in one or more of the distribution stations, right? We'll get into exactly how this might work later. How bad could this get? So one of the things that could happen is a black start. Now, if there's any civil engineers in the audience, this sort of makes your heart skip a beat. Like, this is a terrifying scenario. Black starts are really bad because generating stations and all these electrical substations are themselves consumers of electricity. And what happens when they don't have electricity? Like, they have pumps and like pulleys and all kinds of computer equipment inside of them that need to operate. And what happens if the entire system just goes down for a bit? It might not be able to come back up. In fact, not every generating station is physically capable of coming back online without an external power source. Only some of them are designated as black start generators that can start the system back up from when it's been totally down, because all the individual stations are just dead. You can't talk to them. There's no like backup there. So black starts are like really, really bad. This is just one from 2003 I pulled out of thin air that impacted like much of the Eastern interconnect. This one mostly was back within 7 hours, as I mentioned here, but some people didn't come back for like days at a time. This could get really, really bad. Especially if you imagine, again, like this happens in a place like Phoenix in the summer. Like if the power were persistently down for days, like you could have a mass exodus like you've only seen in zombie movies. Like this could get super bad. And even I think experts would agree that like this was kind of a good scenario as far as black starts are concerned. These are like unplanned fire drills that we're not necessarily really prepared for. How do you test for this sort of thing? You're trying to bring the power grid back up from like complete blackness in a way that like it's just not designed to do. And a lot of these black start generators we're using for the very first time, and if they don't work, then like all of our plan Bs and Cs are suddenly in effect. So this stuff start to get really scary, where the power could potentially be out for a significant amount of time over a vast amount of area. But of course, it can always be worse. So how much worse? So imagine for a moment taking the link from the transmission station and the generating station and just abruptly severing it, right? You just open the relay such that it's not connected anymore. Like, what effect would that have on the system? Like, what would that do to the equipment? So here I've pictured is an actual turbine. This one is from Germany, if I remember correctly. But this is a turbine that you might see in a typical nuclear generating station. This thing is massive in both senses of the word. Both in senses that it's very large, you can see some cars behind it, but also in the sense that it weighs like a lot. And the angular momentum of this turbine is the thing that is powering the grid. It's the thing that's pushing the electrons down the wire, right? And so suddenly, if you were to sever that wire and it's like no longer able to like accept the electrons down, you're going to get this intense torquing force on the turbine that's spinning at something around 1800 RPMs, right? If you're lucky, this will damage the turbine. If you're unlucky, it will catastrophically fail. And we don't exactly just have extras of these laying around. Well, except for this one, I guess. We do have at least one laying around in Germany. Maybe they'll let us borrow theirs. But like, you know, we would have to begin manufacturing new turbines when these things get damaged. Like, just think about that. Like, we're talking about outages of like months, if not years. Not to mention all the downstream like equipment that isn't specifically this individual turbine. So this is really, really bad. But it can still be worse. So you've been probably taught this in school, that there are two types of materials. There are conductors and there are insulators. This is, of course, a lie. All materials are conductors. All materials are insulators. They exist on a spectrum. And anything, if given enough power, will conduct electricity. For example, here's open air conducting electricity I present to you. You might see where I'm going with this. If open air can conduct electricity here, maybe it can there too. You have to understand that there is no such thing as disconnecting an electrical network. You can only increase resistance. And what does resistance plus current equal? It makes heat. So the first thing that happens if you disconnect suddenly this transmission station from the generating station is that it bursts into fucking flames. The whole thing burns to the ground because an entire city's worth of energy is suddenly being resisted by something that cannot resist it. So it will conduct electricity no matter what you put in front of it, and the whole thing burns down. So that's not great. And we don't have spare transmission stations just laying around. You can't just like make another one. This is a single point of failure. Everything is down for a really long amount of time, which is also why these are secure facilities generally. But it can still be worse. All right, so in your house, you probably got one of these things. If you don't, I don't know what you're doing. This is a circuit breaker. So the electrical cables, the actual copper wires in your house are only rated to handle so much current, beyond which they also burst into flames. But even these, the circuit breakers themselves, are rated for a certain amount of electricity. The electrical grid, however, is perfectly capable of sending you a lot of electricity, way more than even these can handle, at which point they burst into flames. So now suddenly this house is on fire, this house is on fire, oh my God, everything's on fire. The electrical system is perfectly capable of sending things so much electricity that just everything bursts into flames. Also, I don't want to like overstate the last point here. I didn't make a slide for it, but especially if we're talking about nuclear generating stations, nuclear generating stations, they all have the same fundamental flaw behind them, which is that if the generating station loses power for long enough, it explodes. So they have these uranium rods that are fueled by the dark sorcery that we call quantum mechanics, and they just keep getting hotter and hotter and hotter. And you have to actively cool them over and over again using pumps and stuff. So the station itself has to have electricity to circulate the water beyond, past the rods. And if the power goes out, then they just get hotter and hotter to the point where they melt anything that you put them in, including the concrete foundation of the building, and melt straight into the ground through the floor. Then the water tanks that it used to sit in will try to leak down into the hole that the uranium rods just poured, at which point they rapidly boil, which we call an explosion. Now, a lot has to happen for that to happen. A lot also has to go wrong, even if like the power is out for a significant amount of time around a nuclear generating station. In the United States, you better believe that the U.S. military would be airlifting diesel fuel to this generating station before we just like let it melt down because the time ran out or something. But nonetheless, once it loses power, the clock starts ticking. So we shouldn't mess around with that. Okay, so DNP3. That's the context. Let's DNP3, of course, lives here, again, as a quick recap. DNP3, luckily, does not exist on the internet. This is actually a good thing, and is probably the only good news you're going to hear all day from me. So DNP3 exists on dedicated lines. Let me take here. Generally speaking, you might be surprised to hear that DNP3 lives on like dedicated lines that doesn't exist on the internet. You might think, wow, wouldn't it be easier just to have put this on the internet? Like, I'm surprised that they took all this trouble. Like, well, dedicated lines already exist. They had to build out the electrical network, so what's one more cable, basically, right? You've already got direct lines between all these substations. In fact, not using these lines and putting things over the internet would just be more trouble and more indirect. So that kind of makes sense. So if you ever want to see where DNP3 lives around your town, it's one of these. It's either up on top of a telephone pole or maybe buried underground, but it kind of lives around the city if you know the right place to look. It's not exactly hidden, it's sort of just there in plain sight, but you never know which telephone pole has it and which doesn't. It's not like it's in every single one of them. It might be buried underground. You just kind of never know. All right, so DNP3 security. What kind of security are we working with here? This is a black slide. That's not a good start. The DNP3 security is, by default, not encrypted, has no authentication, and no authorization. So you might have questions. Yeah. You might have questions, questions like, what the fuck? Let's get into that. So DNP3 is very old. It was, you could say, developed like around 1993. Here's some other things that came out in 1993. One of the things that people were not doing in 1993 was encrypting traffic. It might not even have been legal at the time for like export restrictions. Shit was wild. So it was like consolidated from some older protocols, because of course people have been remotely operating these like before like modern computers even existed. So like we had like Modbus and proprietary protocols that all were this like old bad times of networking where like there wasn't any singular protocol that anything talked, everything was some industry specific protocol and nothing talked to each other, nothing was interoperable, and it was awful. So DNP3 was actually a much improved version of this. It was open, vendor independent, and interoperable. And that alone is like a minor miracle if you know anything about this kind of industry. So that's awesome actually. Maybe I lied about having only one other good piece of good news. Some people do, even way back then, recognize that like, you know, it's probably not great. So maybe we could bolt on some security by like adding in what they used to call bump in the wire solutions, basically like an IPsec tunnel between say like the EMS and the RTU or something like that. That way like over the wire, there's like encrypted connections. Like this, it doesn't do nothing, but there's like a couple of problems with it. One is that it still doesn't solve the problem that an individual substation is perfectly capable of operating every other substation. So like, and those are not secure facilities. You've seen them around your town. They're not manned, like there's no human beings there. There's just a fence that keeps kids from like accidentally wandering onto it. But it, like, they're not like a secure facility, right? It also doesn't, so there's another like problem with just encrypting these things with an IPsec tunnel, which is that the operators of these networks are understandably very hesitant to not understand what's happening on their network. They want to have like full visibility into everything because when power goes down, it's very serious. And so they're hesitant to sort of add on these extra like doodads to the network that might add extra complexity for some vague notion of security that doesn't even offer a full solution. So these IPsec tunnels like may or may not even be in place. So one of the major issues with trying to secure this is the operational requirements of the equipment in these electrical substations. So they have to run for decades with no maintenance and no downtime. Like, can you imagine the kind of hardware? You can't just like buy any old hardware to use on these things. You can't just like go to a Best Buy and like buy a computer and put it in one of these things. They have to operate in hot and cold. There's no server room that's like air conditioned inside of these things. You can't have fans to cool down the computer. They have to be completely passively cooled. So these RTUs are really expensive because they're rated for exactly this, right? They have to run for a really, really long time. Also, that means that any particular piece of hardware that you see out in the wild might be really, really old. For some of the audience members, there might very well be RTUs in operation that are older than you, which is just wild. And one of the things you might one of the conclusions you might draw from that is that some of that hardware is just physically incapable of doing encryption. It just doesn't have the necessary CPU cycles to encrypt the connections. It's just too old, it's too slow to do that. That would mean upgrading the RTU hardware on like millions and millions of electrical substations, which just from the back of envelope math costs like many, many billions of dollars in hardware that we don't have. So there is this thing that's called DNP3 secure authentication. And again, because we went to the George Lucas School for Numbering Things, it's version 5. This adds encryption to the system. So we take this diagram as we had before, we add keys to it. So each substation has a key, and that way the energy management system can encrypt the communications out to the individual substations. So that's cool, right? We can encrypt those connections. There's just one problem with this though. That's good. By default, or I should say by the specification of DNP3 SAv6, all of these keys are in fact the same key. It's just a symmetric key. They're all the same key. So you tried. So the substations are still perfectly capable of operating all the other substations. In fact, this wound up becoming so like well-known-ish that I have it on good authority that many of the implementations just violently or flagrantly violate the spec and just issue the different substations different keys because they're aware of this problem. So like some of the implementations just violate the spec. Like that's fun. So yeah, in this system, EMS can send a command to an individual substation, but this substation can also send a command to this substation, and there's just nothing preventing it from doing that. So like that's not great. So also dipping down a little bit about DNP3 like as a protocol. I didn't want to like get into the weeds here about like individual frames and byte lengths and stuff like that, but DNP3 is old. It's from the 90s. I mentioned it does things like it imports its own transport layer because it didn't assume that there already was one. It's assumed because like you could be putting this on top of a layer that isn't TCP/IP because it didn't exist at the time. So like you can do DNP3 over serial, things like that. So you can still have like an addressing layer even over serial. It's like a whole thing. That adds a lot of complexity. It's a binary protocol. It's extremely complex. There's an asterisk that says, I know that complexity is subjective, but in this person's humble opinion, it's very complex. Implementations often written in C if you're lucky. A lot of these devices are super old and embedded, and they have to be rated to like operate for decades at a time, meaning that a lot of the implementations are just made in assembly in like whatever hardware that they're meant to run in. That way there's no compiler shenanigans because they're afraid of compilers going crazy and doing things they didn't anticipate. So this all adds up to an oxygen-rich environment. We also, software that hasn't been updated for decades, this all adds up to an oxygen-rich environment for memory corruption vulnerabilities. These are just a handful, a smattering of memory corruption vulnerabilities that you can find if you just Google for DNP3 CVE. Now, the world is like filled with many, many, many implementations. All kinds of devices made by all sorts of manufacturers, and they all sort of share this in common. In fact, two on the right there, the upper right, aren't even RTU hardware. Those are the Wireshark dissectors for DNP3. So even like the hackers who tried to make a Wireshark dissector couldn't get it right. So, like that's a thing too. So even if there is a strong authentication, if we do have a great protocol on this, like or a good encryption layer, the implementations just necessarily have to be so complex and exist in this operational environment where there are no patches for decades at a time, that vulnerabilities are just going to be kind of everywhere. The good news here, if you can call it that, again, here I am giving you good news in violation of my own rule, that the world is so heterogeneous in the power grid across the United States, that there isn't any one CVE that would give you access to everything, right? Like these are going to be device specific, version specific. Even in a single town, even if they only used one piece of hardware, you're probably going to get different versions like every single time you deploy a new RTU. And they're going to be vastly different, and you're never going to update them. So the impact, kind of the blast radius of any particular CVE might be small. So I don't know, maybe take that as good news, maybe. So let's talk a little bit about the future. There is a thing that is DNP3 Secure Authentication v6. I have been ever so lightly involved in this. I had nothing to do with the design of it, but early on I sat in on some meetings. You can see even from their statement, from the announcement / website for it, that this offers authentication and encryption for data confidentiality. That's like a good thing. As well as some stuff that's just like good modern cryptography, I would say, like AES in GCM mode, stuff that would make modern cryptographers really happy. And a lot of the problems that SAv6 face aren't fundamentally like deep computer security problems. It's not like we don't know in the year 2024 how to securely authenticate to a remote computer. It's not like we don't know what good cryptography looks like. It's not like the designers of these protocols don't understand any of that stuff. It's that the operational environment that they live in is fundamentally really hard. And how are you supposed to update these things that have these operational requirements where they just can't go down ever? Also, the individual machines that they exist on are just so expensive that the budgets of the individual utilities don't cover refreshing the hardware every 5 years or whatever. So this really winds up being more of a budgetary problem than it is a computer security problem in any real sense. So what can we do about this? Utilities are, at least in the United States, mostly local and regional. We do have a Department of Energy in the US, but they're not really responsible for this sort of thing, for building out individual substations and operating them. That comes down to your power utility, which is hyper-local. This is something that is maybe statewide, most likely local. So I think if I were to leave you with one piece of advice, it would be that if your utility asks you to raise rates to upgrade equipment, say yes. And with that, that's all I've got for you. Thank you very much. I've got some image attribution here. Yes, some questions. Let's do questions.
Not a question, but
yeah.
I can make it worse. So
yeah.
There was a study done by PERC 10 years ago, and they identified 9 transmission stations where if they were taken out, the entire North American grid would fail for months, if not years.
Yeah, I believe that. Can everybody hear that by chance? Do we need to pass it or anything? Oh, yeah. Somebody in the back gave a thumbs up. Yeah, so those transmission stations are super scary. Those things tend to be secure facilities that like I said, have guys with guns and no sense of humor because of exactly that. They represent a single point of failure for a pretty large area, especially since they can cause a black start for very large sections. I do know that because of their relationship to generating stations, sometimes they co-locate instead of generating stations. And those things get really secure. The Department of Energy does not fuck around. Yeah. So yeah, I completely agree that security for those things represents an incredibly important aspect of the entire picture, both from a computer network perspective, making sure that we're not remotely operating the computers in there in a non-authorized way, but also a physical security standpoint. If somebody were to, in a realistic scenario, if you imagine somebody is attacking the U.S. power grid in a way that isn't just a prank from a teenager, but somebody who's actually trying to take stuff down, it's probably a hostile foreign nation, right? This wouldn't be something that we just shrug off or we investigate. This would be an act of war. And in such a scenario, like we would really be concerned also about like physical attacks against the power grid. And in that case, like, yeah, the like transmission stations, like there's only a finite number of them that could represent a real choke point on like the energy production for, you know, all the interconnects. We basically have 3 major interconnects in the United States. There's like, I should have had a slide for this. There's the Eastern, Western, and then Texas, where they just like have cowboy hats and shooting guns into the air saying like, we have our own power grid, hee-haw. Boy, yeah, so maybe it would have been nice recently for Texas to be able to like, you know, send and receive power to other grids. So, you know, maybe there is actually a future where Texas reconnects to one of the other interconnects. They do neighbor them, obviously. So, you know, there's that. Do you have any other questions? Yes, question.
Observation, really. If you want to see real world manifestation of what some of the things you're talking about,
Yeah.
because they are under both physical and cyber attack daily. And so you can watch them figure out supply chain issues. You know, this is one critical transformer, figure out where do we get that thing. It's like a halfway around the world.
Yeah, completely agree. Especially the physical attacks on the power grid, you can really see there. There's the nuclear generating station in I'm never going to say that correctly, Zaporizhia.
We're talking about the thermal problem.
Yeah.
And that's an acid physical manifestation
Yeah.
as the Russians kill off the staff and the whole thing.
Yeah, exactly, and that's when like international agencies step in and be like, okay, let's not let this get out of hand.
The resilience of the cyber resilience of the Ukrainian grid can be demonstrated by the fact that Russians resorting to kinetic attacks
Yeah.
to take it down.
I agree. In fact, that was one of my first takeaways of like the invasion was we were always told that like, you know, the Russian cyber army is like, they're the boogeyman. They're so capable that like they could just take down the power grid, but then like it just didn't happen, right? Like I'm not saying that there were no cyber intrusions or this or that, but like the light stayed on. So, you know, there are other complications, partly due to the capabilities of the, you know, Russian cyber forces, but also just like things get really complicated when you try to like replicate these attacks in the real world and also en masse. Have any other questions, comments?
What would you do
Yeah.
with the issues you were talking about if you were God Emperor for a day?
Oh, God Emperor for a day. We're renaming DNP. That's one. We're giving it something better. I think that like a hardware refresh is for sure like one thing that would super help. That like this isn't a thing that you have to do every 5 years. Like there really is like a certain bar beyond which like if you can do cryptography, then like we can solve this problem. Like we know how to do authentication. SAv6 is actually really good. I don't want to like put the like official Dan Petro stamp of approval on it. There are no vulnerabilities in this protocol. It's super new. Like, but it still remains complex. The implementations are low level, but the broad swaths of it really do strike at the heart of the fundamental problem, which is that like only the energy management system should be able to operate the machinery and nobody else. The packets need to be encrypted or at least authenticated. A lot of operators actually really like to have things in authentication only and no encryption mode. That way you can still like inspect all the packets on the wires. Like you don't have this system obfuscating the systems, but at the same time, you still have authentication so that the machinery doesn't just get turned on or off by like randos. That's not even that wild, like a hardware refresh. That's just a budgetary problem. I say just, you know, but like, again, because this isn't really a national problem, it's like a state and local problem. This comes up as ballot measures or as surveys or whatever. Like your local utility is going to bug you and say, hey, we're going to increase your rates because we need to like do something that isn't going to improve your service. Like everybody says no. So that's tough. And I don't know how to solve that problem other than, you know, being God Emperor for a day. Any last straggling questions? All right, that's it. Thanks a lot.